Hi, everybody. Welcome to Birdie in the Books. I'm AKA Alicia. I am here today, exciting news, with one of my favorite new authors, Erika T. Wurth. Erika, do you mind introducing yourself? Because I always feel weird introducing authors when they're right there.
All right. Yeah, no, I don't mind at all. So I'm a professor and a writer, and some of the highlights from my last book, White Horse, was on Good Morning America, and yeah, there it is. I was a Target pick of the month, and I was like a New York Times editor pick, and so yeah, I
Book
had
of the
some
month.
really highlights with White Horse.
Yeah, I'm excited. I didn't know you were having a second book come out, and then I found out, and I was like, I need to read that right now. It was one of my favorite books. White Horse was one of my favorite books of 2022 when I read it. Oops,
Oh,
you can see it.
thank you. I appreciate that.
I read it the month it came out with a book club that I'm a part of, and everybody loved it.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yay.
So this is your sophomore novel, The Haunting of Room 904. And I like to start all of my introduction interviews with what made you start writing, or what is your writing process, and how did you start, or what inspired you to write? I know that's like
Yeah.
three questions in one, but
I do the same thing, and then I'm like, why are they confused? But my brain likes it. Yeah. So
yeah,
White Horse,
exactly.
right? They have to start really quickly with the log lines. Like White Horse has a really simple log line, right? Like, it's a woman who resents the mother who she thinks abandoned her when she was 2 days old, but when she touches what seems to be kind of almost a magical or haunted bracelet, a bracelet of her mother's ghost starts haunting her. She has to find out, what happened to her mother after all. Whereas The Haunting of Room 904, it is a very complex plot. Some people are going to love and some people are not. I think I was weaving a lot into White Horse as well. With The Haunting of Room 904, I have built it down to a woman with mysterious powers has 3 weeks to solve a paranormal crime or her mother dies. So obviously, they both seem like they're kind of about mothers, but the second one is more about siblings, which has been on my mind lately. What really made me start writing? That's always kind of mysterious, right? Like I don't know. Like I was a super nerdy kid, and I did have kind of a troubled home. My parents were working class, but they had become middle class. My mom was, a woman of indigenous descent and also black descent, British descent for that matter, and from totally different tribal backgrounds. My dad was a white dude. From Staten Island. And, there were kind of beautiful parts about their marriage, but there were also really terrible parts because my dad was an alcoholic. So I escaped into literature and I escaped into horror and science fiction and fantasy. And that's what I really loved. And, for some reason, I just decided I'm going to be a writer. I didn't know any writers. I had no idea how one did that. But I wanted to do that. My parents were not the happiest about it. And so when I went to college and then PhD school and a professor, people, especially for, around people my age, really dissuaded me. They were like, no, that's not real literature. Horror isn't real literature. Science fiction and fantasy isn't real literature. And I, stubborn as I wanted so badly to be taken seriously. And because I had this serious background, I, what we call literary fiction kind of speak to those more serious parts of my background. So for a long time, that's what I did. I published with small presses and I published kind of serious literature about urban Indian life. And I think, the culture kind of wasn't ready for it. And then I decided I really missed the dragons and I missed the spaceships and I missed the ghosts. And, horror was kind of my first stop there because it has a kind of darkness and a seriousness, and it's mainly set, usually anyway, in kind of a realistic setting. So I was familiar with that. But I could do cool stuff like I could have portals and ghosts and stuff like that, and magical bracelets. And so that's kind of how that got started later in life for me.
That was one question you actually were going to the next question I wanted. At least in the two books that I have read from you, you tend to focus on familial connection. I'm assuming that's on purpose. With the Haunting of Room 904, it's siblings, and with White Horse, it was a mother and a daughter.
Yeah.
So, what made you want to turn that into like the horror and speculativeness of the horror genre.
Yeah, I think that a lot of, I mean, if you think about horror, sometimes it's a group of strangers, right? Or a group of friends in a weird circumstance. I like that too. That's something that I would be open to and have done that to a degree in
Mhm.
904 is the in some ways the main characters are really Olivia and Alejandro, and they're friends who live together, right? They have this sort of platonic, almost marriage,
Yeah.
right? He's queer and she's somewhat queer, but she's mainly straight, and she doesn't want to have real like long-standing relationships, right? And for a while there, he doesn't either. So in any
She's
case, they're right. The
yeah.
friend, yes, just her. She's very, So, but I think that what makes good literature is tension. And how do you achieve like the most immediate tension? Well, you want to have people who have long-standing histories with one another, right? And so for me, especially as a person of indigenous descent, I'm very interested in the ways in which our families interact with one another and the tensions there. And then what happens, like what's the relationship between that and the previous generations, right? What's happening now that really started happening, generations ago.
I think that's the most fascinating part is because it's like for me, for reading both of your books, it's even though you focus on the indigenous part of it, it's universal. We all have issues with our family members. We all have unfinished business, so to speak. So it even though you're focusing on indigenous people, um, it's universal in a sense.
Yeah, I think that the problem, right, is that sort of the way in which a lot of literature of color and definitely indigenous literature has been sold to non-indigenous people as, okay, here is how you'll learn about indigenous people. And like I think that if you're a white dude from the South, if you're back in Detroit, it doesn't matter. You're going to end up reflecting part of your community, your background, whatever. It literally doesn't matter. But unfortunately, I think sometimes with indigenous stuff, it's definitely seen as like, here's your cultural lesson. And a lot of times people, the value of our works is seen within that. So I always try to go really against that. And my model is Rebecca Roanhurst. Rebecca is able to take all of these indigenous elements and make a completely organic, speculative world. And really, she's my model in that way. And that's what I try to do.
I love her. She's one of my favorites. For when it comes to specifically this, the haunting of room 904, you focus on the massacre, the Sand Creek massacre, and that is one of them, one that I personally didn't know anything about. So I love when books give me the push to look into what actually happened.
Yeah.
And how do you go about weaving the speculative elements to your your stories into what actually happened and like meshing it together?
Yeah. I mean, if you, not to compare myself to Faulkner, because I think of him as like a very, I guess what you call modernist writer, and I'm not interested in that. I really like narrative structure, and I think there are lots of different ways to do it.
Mhm.
And I think, his is a very what we now call postmodern, right? But it was modernism at the time. But he had very like his was fiction. And it was about the South, and it was about the legacy of slavery, right? And and so how all these characters interacted with
Mhm.
one another. So I think that there are ways to do very real things in fiction, whether it's speculative or not. I think for me, I grew up right outside of Denver. So the Sand Creek Massacre occurred really not that far from me. My cousin is also like he's of much more African descent than my family, and he's different tribes, including Cheyenne and Arapaho. And his ancestors had relatives that died at the massacre. So these things were on my mind a
Mhm.
lot of my life. And it feels disrespectful to pretend it doesn't exist, especially considering that I'm an Indigenous person who grew up right by it, right? So I felt like I love all the cool, fun, speculative elements of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And I think horror, what is more overtly horrific than genocide? And that particular massacre, which I call the massacre out of respect to the survivors, right? Um, because it was a if you've read about it, it's
Mhm.
possibly the most traumatic things I've ever read. Like it's really, really, really hard. Like at one point, my editor, he had suggested having these chapters that take place at the massacre, and I'm like, I don't know, man, that's a lot for a lot of reasons. And so I did it the way I did it, that I felt was the right way for someone like me to approach it. But what's more
Mhm.
horror, like what's more horrific than genocide? What would create more hauntings than genocide? So I think that for me, that's why I think it's not an awkward fit. I think it's a perfect fit talking about speculative elements alongside genocide and massacre. So
Going off of that, you also have like generational, I don't want to say curses, but like they have people in this book suffering from what their ancestors did. And one comes from the box and the doll. And can I just tell you, the doll terrified me?
everyone says
That's
so.
just a huge, and you didn't, I couldn't look in mirrors for a couple days.
Oh wow! Yay!
Uh, but yeah, it's so interesting to me how we can have something happen in our past and we don't even know it happened because it was so far removed from our generation, but we're still dealing with the ramifications of it.
Absolutely. I think that there's a theme of reconciliation in the book, right? People are like, well, I shouldn't have to feel guilty for what my ancestors did. But the problem is that, these things affect us, right? And we have the right to know. Like, I think what I was trying to show is that the white characters had ancestors who did things at the massacre were like, hey, actually, I do want to know. I do. What can I do to understand my own history better? Because I think that's this country in some ways, like it mythologizes our history, right? And then we don't look at the bad things. But then does that really help us? I mean, I understand that's how some people would want it, but I that's not how everyone wants it. And I think for the indigenous folks, they know that there are things that happened back then that affect them negatively now, and they need to be fixed in order for us to move forward in a way that's mentally and spiritually and physically healthy.
And there's so many things like as an adult that I've had to go and find information because like we didn't learn much about it in school. Like I didn't learn about the Sand Creek Massacre until I read your book. Like there's so many things in history that isn't widely talked about and should be.
Yeah, and to be clear, so Tommy Orange, who's more right literary realism, and I think you could call him vaguely postmodern. He put out his second book, Wandering Stars, and he is of Cheyenne Arapaho descent, and he's a enrolled citizen of that nation, the same nation my cousin is enrolled with. And so if people are curious of a more, of a different take from someone from that background, I would absolutely invite people to read it. It's called Wandering Stars. So, but yeah, I think these things, like I said, I think what comes down to
And I
is,
highly
you know,
recommend that book. I just finished it.
yeah, totally. Or like, who I think about all the time? I think about Grady Hendrix because he's another one that does all the things that I really love and I admire because he, he's like David Lynch. His subject matter is super weird, but because he hits these traditional thematic beats, like you just enjoy it and you're pulled along and it's fun and it's compelling and it's scary and it's great. And I think he also like if you read my favorite, which is a lot of people's favorite, right? It's the book that made him, the Southern Books Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. There's stuff about the way sexism works in white neighborhoods. There's stuff about how racism works and black neighborhoods when the white characters go to black neighborhoods for help and they're like, really? Um, and there, in fact, I would say there were moments, and there's stuff about like Reagan and Bush era politics. The guy really knows how to weave information and background and politics and history into a book and still make it just be a book that you're going to breeze through. And that's something I admire a lot.
Yeah. And I give him credit because he writes for being a man, he writes women very true to the every part of a woman, like the good part, the bad part, the part nobody wants to see. Like there's many authors that I say the opposite to. It's a critique, but like he writes women realistically.
Yeah, and honestly, but to read, if you want to read a woman writing women, I think really, really well. Who I think I wish every single thing she wrote would be turned into a movie or a series on television. Would be Rachel Harrison. I think she writes women really, really well. Like I totally agree with you about Hendricks, absolutely. But boy, Harrison, like for me, it's another one, just like a page turner. Boom, 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 you know.
But I think you write that way too. Like you write women that are just, you don't hide the bad parts. Like Olivia is not perfect at all. She's got kind of like, she's very standoffish with when it comes to romantic relationships and keeps everybody around her. And it's more realistic. And is it hard to read because you're just like, I don't want to think of that in myself? Yes, sometimes, but it's more, I picture her wearing like Doc Martens and walking around the hotel before everything came out about her sister.
Yeah,
I
I
don't know
think
why, I just picture Doc Martens.
say I think in a way that's probably more Carrie from Whitehorse, because Carrie is she's sort of heavy metal femme, like she's like the girls I grew up with, where she's going to wear a heavy metal t-shirt and a short skirt, jeans, and like a torn up, tank top. And she has long hair. Olivia's more a millennial, and she's very femme, and I see her wearing dresses and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, I think for me it's the small evolution, right? Because Olivia and Carrie are very different, and then the book that I'm working now she's spectacularly different from the other two. So Carrie, right, is like I she's hard. Like she's like occasionally I have sex with men and that's it. Olivia, almost entertains relationships for like a moment as long as they understand
Yeah.
monogamous. You know what I mean? And she has, for her, as far as she's concerned, she has a great monogamous relationship with her like gay husband. So she's very different, and I see her as like she's funny, but obviously Carrie's like hard edged, sarcastic, funny, and Olivia's kind of like more millennial autotoast, right? So I kind of yeah, I like to think that my work in any case is like well paced, and I do really care deep about structure and story. So yeah.
I love the way you structure your books because it's just like you never want to stop reading. And I'm not gonna lie, I had to stop reading because I live in a very old house and things creak and make noise, and I couldn't sleep if I read past like 8 p.m.
Yeah, that's always the goal. Like the book that I'm really obsessed with now is Josh Mellerman's Incidents Around the House. Because for me, if I watch or read something that really scares me, it helps me sleep because my brain is just so distracted by all these problems and issues and blah, blah, blah.
Really?
And so for me, oh yeah, like literally when I find a book that really scares me, I'm so happy because I know I'm going to sleep.
I might have to try that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I like that you also focus. You do it in Whitehorse as well, but I saw it more in The Haunting of Room 904. The found family. Like Olivia had her family, but the found family, like um, Alejandro, her friends from college, like they all had each other's back, and it's just nice to see. Like my mom used to say this statement of friends are the family that you choose. And you can
Absolutely.
see that even though they don't get along all the time, that they still care about each other, even when it gets to the point where they frustrate each other.
Yeah, I think so. Carrie doesn't have her mother, right? And so she kind of clings to her cousin because she likes to think she's completely emotionally independent, but she is essentially, as far as she's concerned, married to her cousin who simply cannot do her and her family in the same
Yeah.
way. Yeah, that's Carrie's lesson to learn. Yeah, Olivia is I think because
Yeah.
Olivia has her mother, she's very close to her mother, and she's lost her father, who she was close to. Her found family, she has a similar relationship to, right? She's able to be close to them, to really talk with them. She has a really good network. I saw her as kind of millennial in this regard, although I know sometimes millennials will be like, actually, my biological family I've cut off. But I felt like I wanted to show like a very different dynamic within a native, like familial structure and friend structure, which was instead of like I'm isolated from everybody like Carrie, which happens to people, I wanted to show like my
Yeah.
biological family was really great. Of course, her sister was problematic her whole life, right? And she's what kind of forms a lot of the novel because, when her sister is, messed up and always on drugs and then in rehab and then seems better and then joins this cult. And then the main character gets this call from her and is like, come, you got to come to the Brown Palace or I'm going to die. And she's like, chill out. And just sort of like the mother's always seen ghosts, and the main character has never seen them and thinks they're not real. And the sister appears as a ghost, right? And it's like, and then she's like, oh my sister actually did die. I feel so guilty. And then on top of it, it turns these paranormal powers on for her, right? So for me, in some ways, the one
Yeah.
messy relationship that's family is what forms the book. Because again, what makes, in my opinion, a good read is tension. Mhm.
And you write grief really well. Like grief changes over time. You can tell that her mother and Olivia are still dealing with the grief, or maybe dealing with it for the first time. That what happened with her sister possibly could not have been prevented, and I guess that they're just realizing that when they talk in the car, the conversation that they have in the car, and it's just I've never seen grief before written in such a realistic way.
Yeah, I really, I grief does evolve over time. It's definitely something that I've experienced, and I think that you're right. Actually, I don't know if I thought about that, so I really appreciate that take because I don't know about other families, but especially when you're talking about suicide, which is, pretty common, I think, in Native families. And unfortunately, anyone can experience this in their family or friend group, what have you. You sit around wondering, especially if the sister says, like, calls you up and says, "I'm going to die if you don't do this," and you don't, and they die. You will wander. You will go around in your head again and again and again. What did I do? What did I do wrong? Why didn't I go there?
Yeah.
Why didn't I do something earlier? There's something I didn't understand that I could have understood that would have prevented this. And I can only imagine how hard that is as a parent as well.
I'm very close with my mom, so like seeing the closeness with her mother and Olivia, like even though Olivia tries to keep her mother at arm's length, she realizes she can't. Like they're all that each other have left because her husband passed away and everything, and it's just I feel like that conversation was like the turning point for them and their relationship.
Yeah, I don't even think she tries to push her mom away. I think she's just young and she's like, I've got my life. And then her mom and her have different takes on things, right? But yeah, they hang out, like just like my mom and I. Like my mom is the only person I day drink with. Because she's from the silent generation and she's 85. So to
Yes,
her, she's gonna have a
same.
drink, right? She's gonna have a drink at 9 is not doable. So she's gonna have a drink at like 3. And so I'm like, okay, like, but yeah, I wanted to show what that looked like
Yeah,
too, because I feel like,
she needs to hang out with my mom and my grandmother.
oh, that's great. I love that. Yeah, I love that. And I think like I wanted to show that like I think a lot of people show this, and I don't want to generalize, but I can say that like I feel like I read a lot of relationships between mothers and daughters where it's like very strained and it's kind of like almost toxic and hateful. So I wanted to show, not that my mom and I don't have our problems, but I wanted to show the way my relationship is with my mom, where we have, more or less, yes, we have conflicts, of course we do, but like we are tight. Like I love my mom and she loves me, and I don't, she doesn't see me as, I don't know. She just sees me as like her friend, a little, almost too much, right? She wants me to hang out with her all the time. Like, mom, I can't do that. But I need as much time for her as I can. So
Same. I wanted to bring this up, but I wasn't sure how to exactly because we did talk about Olivia's sister's suicide, and I did put the information of that you left at the back of the book in the
yeah,
description box. Native communities experience higher rates of suicide compared to all other racial or ethnic groups in the U.S. I didn't realize it was that high. Like, I knew it happened, but I didn't realize it was literally 2.5 times more in the indigenous community than in any other community.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't want to speak for any other family or
Like,
community.
that broke my heart.
No, it's there's a lot of natives talk about why this is. Like for example, people say, "Oh, natives, we have higher rates of alcoholism." It turns out we don't. It's like if they've done study after study
Mhm.
to show that we don't. What it is right. We're often not as well off, and so if you see like in a white family that's well off or even middle class, like an alcoholic relative is kind of protected and they still might be able to keep their job. And that's not necessarily going to happen, in a native community because there are fewer cushions that are created by money, right? Suicide, unfortunately, is absolutely higher rates.
Yeah.
I personally believe, and I've talked with a lot of different natives about this, I personally believe, although I didn't discuss this in the book, that's more in White Horse. So it's in the sub background that it has to do, from what people understand, it has to
Mhm.
do with sexual abuse in day schools and boarding schools, Native American day and boarding schools. My grandmother, luckily, she went to, I guess, what you call a day school because she was an urban Indian. She was in Houston. So I'm not even sure it's considered an Indian, like Indian school, but it was mainly urban Indians. And it was run by
Yeah.
Irish nuns. Same thing as it was everywhere. But there, for example, there was a couple of communities in Canada and they were experiencing such wildly high rates of suicide amongst the children that they were like, "What is going on? What in God's name? This is worse than just unimaginably bad." So what they did was they did an extensive like amount of research, and they found out it was one priest. One. He had gone from community to community a generation or two before that, molesting all of these kids who then molested their own kids in that cycle of abuse. And that is why these kids had such
It's cyclical.
unbelievable suicide. Exactly. So there are real concrete and terrible things as to, again, when people are like, oh, that's all in the past.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's not. Not if your parent, unfortunately, is repeating the cycle and it is causing a rash of suicides now. So yeah, these things really do matter in terms of really looking at their root causes.
The rest of that was they saw the most rates between the ages of 10 and 24, which that was the most shocking part to me, that they that young,
Yeah,
because that's extremely young on both ends.
yeah, I know.
And that's like my younger siblings that age, and I'm just like, I
There are stories that
wouldn't
I've
wish that
read.
on anybody.
Yeah, it's really hard to read. I think with the main character in 904, basically, I think what's going on is sure that might be part of their like that's not part of their immediate familial background, but what's going on with her is she is seeing paranormal visions her whole life, and her mom kind of believes her, but her sister, who she's closest to, simply does not believe her, and so she kind of doesn't believe herself, and so she's kind of like drinking or drugging to just make those go away.
Right.
And then once she like kind of reforms, she's still seeking community that her family can't provide. Her mom kind of again. And so she ends up with this cult, right? And they not only do they believe her, but they've got all sorts of things set up to, try to rectify what their ancestors did through ceremony, through believing in paranormal, indigenous, like paranormal and not, and then people who were involved in indigenous genocide right in there and all their paranormal activity. So of course she wants to join it, but it ends up being her destruction. So
And when it's a cult like that, they put on someone that's more vulnerable, I guess is the right word, or more
yeah,
searching for community in that sense.
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Since with the way you weave the actual events in, including the high levels of suicide, is that hard for you to research because it is so difficult? And it is that hard for you at all, or does that take more time because it might make you like feel down or depressed or something like that?
I think that trying to find the root causes of some of the worst things that I've experienced in my community or family or whatever actually in some ways helps, because otherwise you can just fall into the belief that like we should assimilate, or we shouldn't, we like we're inherently weaker, or things like that that are really terribly racist beliefs that you can almost internalize. And then just seeing like, no, there are root causes for this, and talking about them and coming up with concrete solutions, um, shows that we're human beings who need like whatever human being needs, right? A community that supports them, a community that says, hey, your spiritual beliefs are valid, your language is valid, all these things that you're feeling are valid. They're not coming from nowhere. If this is happening in your family, there's a reason, right? So I think actually in a way they help me. Yes, they're hard to read about, of course, but they knowing these root causes are helpful.
It's more of a positive spin on it than a lot of people can take. You cover these hard topics in both of your books, and it sounds like your newest book coming out. Um, you always seem to end on a positive note, which I really appreciate, because a lot of horror that's out now that I think is just gruesome for the sake of being gruesome, and you always leave it with like some sort of everything's not perfect, but there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, as a former kind of literary realism person, there was almost like it's not art unless it ends badly, right? And I think that there are books that, it's probably ethically logical for the book to end, badly, because like maybe a bad character needs to meet their fate, or a good character, we need to accept that bad things happen to good people. And I think there's a real place for that. But I think for me, it's a joke that I made on threads that apparently a bunch of people got mad about. But like I think there's girl horror and there's boy horror, and boy horror is like horror and slasher and like
Yes.
cool, get chopped up, cool. But that's not scary to me. That's just kind of gross,
Yeah.
and that's fine. Like I'll watch Scream. I like
Mm,
Scream. Um, but and to be clear, like it
yeah.
really doesn't matter the gender, because I think Josh Mallerman is a girl horror completely, because he is genuinely terrifying psychological horror. And there's very little gore, but I'm much more frightened in like an interesting way. And I guess what it came down to is I got tired of that, being in the literary realism space, and I don't try to make it an easy happy ending. Like, it's not like, for example, um, like we see like, oh, and they got married and they had like kids and a white picket fence, because that would be inauthentic for me and my characters. But I think that a sense of like a journey that has some sort of at the end of it, like, you kind of can say, okay, this character has gone through something, and they've learned something, and there's some hope. Maybe they'll die tomorrow, but today they kind of feel like, hey, I went through this for a reason. I don't think that's a bad thing, you know?
I prefer that. Like it's not everything is perfect, but it's realistic.
Yeah.
Things might be really, really bad, but there is a positive side to everything. It's just how you look at it.
Yeah.
And with you being a professor yourself, do you take anything that you've learned from like your professorships and turn that into your own writing, or like take inspiration, or how does that work for you, or it's completely separate?
Yeah, I think that I did my doctorate in creative writing and literature. I took workshops, I took literature courses, I wrote a half creative and half critical thesis. And sometimes I write, essays or essays on, Native American fiction for like the Writer's Chronicle, for example. And then I just did an in conversation for them with Paul Tremblay and Rachel
Mhm.
Harrison, and her book Bochica is coming out with Carolina Flores. And I always forget her last, she's got two last names. I hate it. But her book is called Bochica, and it's wonderful. And
That must be
so,
an amazing conversation.
yeah, they're all smart people. And I try to always like, I'll pick three people for something, and then a different three people for another thing, just because I think like that's important to spread the love. but it's, it's hard to do. But in any case, yeah, what I think, what I was trained to think a lot about was, and I trained my students initially was, it was around language, right? And characterization was kind of an afterthought to a degree if we're talking about fiction, and language and concept, because that's what literary writers value because they kind of align themselves with poets. And so, as when I would say, well, I really value story and I value structure and I want to understand it better. So eventually, once I read craft books that honestly do that better, and they're more commercial craft books that literary writers are often kind of snobbish about, like Save the Cat Writes a Novel, or Jane Cleland's Mastering Suspense Structure Plot, my friend Ben Percy's Thrill Me, just a great book. Chuck Wendig's Damn Fine Story. These are books that really talk about these sort of structural issues and plot issues and how to make them work in a more concrete way. Once I learned how to do that, I certainly brought that to my own work, and then I brought it to my students because they were taking workshops where they weren't really talking much about story and structure, and I wanted them to be able to do that. So yeah, I revamped my classes, especially my advanced or graduate level classes, so that my students would workshop a chapter, read, Save the Cat's beat sheet. They would do a beat sheet for a book that that I assigned, right? So they would do that beat sheet. Then they would do a beat sheet for their own novel, just so they could get a sense of how something might look moving forward. It doesn't mean they can't move the parts around and, have an unhappy ending. But yeah, that was really important to me to give, to work in myself and then to give back to my students.
I wish I had a creative writing teacher like you when I was in college.
I was a terrible one initially. Well, I wasn't terrible, but I would often say, "Well, no genre, guys, because there's nothing wrong with it, but I'm not sure how to pitch it," right? And that was true, but then I realized, like, no, that's stupid. Why would I do that? And so I just really burned everything down as a writer, as a professor, and I incorporated that.
I know a lot of writers work very differently, but what is the first spark of an idea for you? Is it normally, does the plot come to you? Does the character come to you and be like, hey, write about me? Does the um do you start with the nonfiction part of it and then wanting to weave that into a speculative horror story? Or how does your process work?
Yeah, I always think those nonfiction elements are kind of fun, right? Like, in The Haunting of Room 904, you have the eBay listings that are haunted objects. And I just think that's, it was really fun to do, or the ghost stop, or ghost equipment fails called it. Because I think that stuff is so great. And I go to eBay and I look at those listings because they're fun. But yeah, the first spark for me is usually like, I think what
Yeah.
matters the most is characterization. But the first spark for me is usually like something random. Like I'm thinking about a sort of horror edge fantasy trilogy, and it was because one of my ancestors used to live in something called District 11. And I was asking someone who's Eastern Cherokee what the hell that meant. And she was like, well, when it was Cherokee territory, it had a Cherokee name. And right in between it being Cherokee
Mhm.
territory and being like whatever it was in Tennessee, they gave it these place name holders like District 11. And I started to understand why in Canada people are like Treaty 9, and that's what they call themselves, stuff like this. And for some reason, that just exploded a whole trilogy for me. So
Yeah.
sometimes, I think it starts for me like that. I love the idea of something starting as a beautiful line, but I'm not like that. I value characterization probably the most, but I try to make plot, like I try to structure my plot and then I give myself lots of room to play afterwards.
I love that. I always find it fascinating to ask authors because everybody comes at it very differently, and I find it fascinating to hear where everybody starts from, or
Yeah.
what like little thing that you won't even think spark an idea that actually sparks an idea.
Mhm.
What is the hardest part for you when it comes to writing?
I actually like revision, but I think the hardest part in some ways is accepting that when you're working with an editor, I don't mind revising. I really don't. But sometimes it's just overwhelming when they're like, yeah, burn all this down. And even if they're right, and even if it's going to make it better, you're like, oh my God, I just wrote all these pages. But you just have to accept that, if you trust your editor, it's going to make it better. Now, if you don't trust your editor, that is a problem. But it looks like I might be working with someone right now who I really, really trust. And,
Mhm.
his, even if it's like overwhelming, I always like spend an evening being like overwhelmed. And then I'm like, okay, right back to the drawing board. But yeah, that'd be some of the hardest part.
I love that because I used to work in public relations and copy editing. So even though it's not exactly the same thing, I kind of understand exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Even though there's a lot of you weave a lot of things together with 904, it all I put it in my review that it seems like this is all like vignettes that you're kind of curious of how it all weaves together, but towards the end, it completely bombshells and makes complete sense. And then and I like really enjoy those type of that you're just like going for the ride and having a good time with it, and then you're just like, I don't even know what's going to happen, but I'm here for it, and then it just all makes sense in the big climax of a speculative work.
Yeah, like I said, I'm sort of obsessed with incense around the house because of its wonderful simplicity. Like you do, like I'm listening to it. I tend to be more of a like I read. I have nothing against people who listen to books, but I'm listening to it again just because I'm trying to learn from it. But I think like there is a deeper thing at the end of the book for
Mm-hmm.
sure. But I think what I admire is that it's able to scare you so much because like the first chapter is 4 lines, 4 fucking lines. And when I was listening to it, I'd already read it. I was like, oh my God, he's so good. He's so good.
Mm-hmm.
He's done so much in such a small amount of space. But for me, I have to admit that I tend to, uh, I'm very delighted by layering, and I'm also really delighted by things that a lot of literary writers like don't understand very well, like red herrings. So for me, some of the layering is there so that you can be surprised. That you think, is this it? And then you're like, this is not it. And I love doing that because I think it's fun, and I love to read books like that where I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea this was coming. And that just is kind of delightful for me. So I try to do it.
It makes it a lot of fun to read. You're just like, I don't even want to put it down. I want to find out what's happening.
So I appreciate that.
Was the hotel was the hotel based on a specific hotel, or was it just something you came up with?
No, the Brown Palace, if you Google it, you can see a picture of the Brown Palace. I grew up, you know, seeing it, when we would drive downtown, like I'm from the country, like west of Denver. And so when we go downtown to the spaghetti factory or whatever, there was this, beautiful hotel you'd pass. And then I'd go to the bar once in a while. There would be events, there's teas there. It is a ridiculously beautiful, beautiful old hotel. And so when I stayed there for research, I got the full tour. I didn't stay in 904 because it's very expensive. It's a suite. But what was part of the spark for this book was room 904 around is supposedly haunted. It is when they were doing construction, they would get phone calls from room 904 when there was no phone in that room. And so that was tremendously compelling to me. And I also thought a lot about how the people who constructed the Brown Palace, in the Brown Palace, yeah, they were, these people were the elite of Denver. And they're, all at the same time, the Sand Creek Massacre is happening, right? These people were going to these elite, parties at the Brown Palace when it was, as soon as it was constructed. And yet, at that same time, their citizens were charged with doing something so tremendously brutal. And so to me, I kind of wanted to bring those two parts of Denver together because they are,
I love the connection between the hotel and the secret society slash later on in the book they call it a cult, the Secret 36. I don't know what that says about me. I'm just so fascinated by like cults and secret societies that I was like, I want like a whole book just on that. Can I get just a book on the secret society?
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted big, like what you might call dark academia vibes for this, if it isn't completely overtly obvious, right?
Mhm.
And to me, that is, if you know, like I'm obsessed with Arv Kwang's Babel. That's one of my favorite books. She manages to have a lot of information and
Yeah.
exposition without it dragging down the book. In fact, it makes it more interesting. It's probably because of that. I mean, if I think about it, I don't know, but I was probably influenced by that because ultimately it's so like what's more compelling than the idea of like a society that like kind of lasts through generations, that changes, that has like money and power and influence, that sort of diminishes over time but still keeps, keeps those secrets, right? And then so you're and then it sort of abuses its power, right? And so you're and yet has this scholarly kind of bent, and they have libraries for books and mysterious rooms under, you know oh, like, to me, there's nothing more compelling than that stuff, you know?
Yeah, and it's so fascinating because no one knows like what's actually happened unless you've been in one or know or read like a first-hand knowledge case or book about it. It's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Going back to you said you're listening to the audiobook. I don't have the audiobook yet, but I have that on pre-order. I'm so excited because I loved White Horse's audiobook specifically so much.
Yeah.
The Do you have any say in the audiobook process? Who does your audio, like who performs your audio, that those kind of things?
I do, and to be clear, I'm listening to Incidents Around the House. I do always buy my own audiobook because, yes, I actually, they always they let me audition people, and they let me suggest people, and they always really try to push me towards North American people, and that's fine. But I feel like I'm more interested in people who are of indigenous descent, who Latino as well, Latine. And
Mhm.
so the first gal, Tonatzin, I thought she was just so perfect for Carrie. It's hard to read an audiobook when that's not necessarily what you do, but she just knocked it out of the park and people loved it. And I found and auditioned in Ron, and I think she's the new person. I'm already seeing some reviews for people who are granted the audiobook, and they're like, she's outstanding. I know her now, like we've met because she's from Denver. She lives in Denver, so that's even cooler. She's also of Apache descent,
So
uh,
cool.
descent, and she, like me, grew up around the Lakotas, and so like she's like just hanging out with her was super cool. And my reading of the Tatter cover actually is going to be my partner, who's a thriller writer, and Ina, and we're all going to be in conversation together. So
Because I, as someone who mainly reads via audio and ebook, it can make an audiobook narrator can make or break a book.
oh yeah, yeah,
Like if
yeah.
it's not the right narrator for whatever type of book it is, could it could destroy your reading enjoyment of whatever the book is.
Yeah, like I said, I'm more of a like, I don't care if it's paper. I love my Nook. Like I read like mainly from my Nook, but I have like some paper books and great. I'm not a big audio book person, but yeah, I had listened to a book that I had blogged, and I was like, I want a better picture of it, and I wanted to read it again, but I didn't have time, so I was listening to it, and the person rating it was god awful,
Mhm.
and it did kind of ruin it for me. So yeah.
So you're open to reading in any type of format, so like ebook, audiobook, physical, all of it.
I don't think there's really any difference between like a paper book and an ebook personally. The only reason I prefer an ebook because A, I just don't want to buy more physical books, even though I do anyway. B, I travel a
Yeah.
lot, and if you finish a book that way, you can just download the next. Um, and C, I like reading, with the Nook light, and I like reading like I'm able to now read laying on my side, and I really like that. But yeah, physical books are beautiful fetish objects. I have a copy of Mexican Gothic hardback because I love that book and I think it was really transformative for me. So I wanted a physical hardback. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's something about it, isn't there?
Yeah, there's just like I love all of it. I'm one of those people that I'll read a little bit, but I have learning disabilities, so I use audio a lot
Yeah,
to like reinforce. So I really appreciate it when authors have a chance to um, be specific about what kind of audiobook narrator they want for their book.
for sure. That matters to me. Like I definitely like those two were to me like I handpicked, and I knew it was wild because when I listened to their voices reading from the book, and this one must have been a real challenge because I had like several native languages in there, Spanish, blah blah blah. Um, and but yeah, I knew they were the one. So
Can we secretly get some information now? We know you have another book coming out. This is um, this is getting released on release day, so this is coming out the day 904 is available. So I will have all the links down bottom where you can get it audiobook, where you can get the e-copy, where you can get the physical copy. Um, can we have a little snippet of what your new book is going to be,
yeah, the deal
or
is
the book you're
not.
working on?
Yeah, I'm definitely that's in the works. But yeah, it's tentatively called The Ghost of Loretto Chapel. I think that was going to change. And it's about a woman, like it's about a couple actually. They met at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe when they were kids. They had a baby really early on, but it didn't stop them. They went and got their MFAs in visual art. They were professors in Chicago for a long time. And now they're successful enough to move back to Santa Fe where they want to be, which is just a great place to be if you're a native artist. And they live in this really old house that was like occupied by other artists for years, another visual artist, and it has a lot of history to it. And the main character starts to be haunted in this house. Like she starts to see things. She's always had paranormal experiences. Her husband is like, you just you need to up your medications. Like this stuff is just bullshit. But at the
Yeah.
same time, her brother, so there's more sibling stuff. Her brother, who's always been a gambler and messy, as a result of their parents' unbelievably, messed up dynamic. Um, he eventually comes to live with them and he just upsets the apple cart in every single way, right? And these hauntings get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it extends
Okay.
into Santa Fe and it most
So,
specifically eventually leads to the Loretto Chapel.
oh, I'm so excited. But I'm already have your book on pre-order, and everybody, um, the links will be down below. The additional information, if you're curious about the Sand Creek massacre and about the suicide rates in Indigenous communities, all that information will be down below. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, gosh, thanks for having me on. It was wonderful.
It was great. Thank you so much, and I hope someday to have you back on my channel.
Oh, absolutely. I know. Sorry about I know there was an occasional delay, but we made it through and it was fantastic. So thank you so much.